Have you ever noticed how, like, just hearing birds outside, like, first thing can really get you thinking?
Yeah.
You know, it's funny because you were sharing some of Kesser and Steen's observations about that very thing.
Yeah.
The birds in their garden,
Mm-hmm.
especially now that it's spring.
Yeah.
And it really just got me thinking, like, how can we help them?
Well, I think it's such a great place to start.
Yeah.
I mean, Kesser and Steen are just so tuned in to what's going on,
Yeah.
in their local environment. And they've been having all these conversations about like, feeding the wild birds
Yeah.
and even creating like better habitats for them.
Yeah.
And it really like makes you think beyond the obvious.
It does. I mean, because when
Yeah.
you mentioned it, it wasn't just about, going and buying a bag of birdseed and tossing it out.
Right.
You were interested in exploring, like, the best ways to actually support the birds.
Exactly.
And I think that's what's so interesting here.
Yeah.
We've got Kesser and Steen's perspectives, some of Oma's wisdom,
Mm-hmm.
and even this really fascinating look at a particular visitor to their garden,
The bullfinch.
the bullfinch, or dompop, as they call it in Danish.
Exactly. I mean, and it's interesting because they actually have pretty like contrasting views.
Yeah.
Just starting with like what kind of birdseed to use.
Right.
And I think that just like highlights something really fundamental about how we interact with nature.
Yeah.
Like what are intentions versus what's the actual impact.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit.
Okay.
You mentioned that Steen's mother has a very generous habit when it comes to feeding the birds.
Yeah.
What's she doing?
Well, she buys a lot of seed
Okay.
and really feels like she's doing her bit,
Yeah.
for the local wildlife. And it seems like her approach is much more about quantity
Yeah.
than being too selective about, who's eating it. Even if it's mostly pigeons cleaning up. For her, it's as simple as just, going and grabbing a bag of seed along with the groceries.
Which sounds well-meaning enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then Kesser brought up some really interesting points about what might actually be in those bags.
Exactly. And I love how Kesser sort of like takes it a layer deeper.
Yeah.
So they start by questioning like, where do these seeds even come from?
Yeah.
And, do they come from plants that might be invasive?
Right.
That could potentially harm the local ecosystem.
Yeah.
They're also wondering like, what were the farming practices used to grow those seeds?
Yes.
Are they organic?
Right.
What's the broader, environmental impact of actually
Yeah.
producing them?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like shifting the focus from just, providing food to thinking about, the whole like ecological footprint.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, we're increasingly aware,
Yeah.
about where our food comes from,
Yeah.
the journey,
Yeah.
the impact of the production of our food. It seems very logical that the same kind of thinking would apply to
Right.
what we give to the birds.
Yeah.
And Steen's father had a much more sort of like detached viewpoint
Yeah.
on this whole thing.
He did.
What was he saying?
Well, he was essentially like, oh, well, it's just for the wild birds.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it reflects a kind of common feeling that maybe when it comes to nature,
Yeah.
we don't need to apply the same sort of level of scrutiny
Yeah.
as we do to other areas of life.
Right.
But I think Kesser's observations really challenged that assumption.
So right away, we've got this contrast.
Yeah.
A seemingly helpful action, like scattering birdseed,
Yeah.
may actually be having unintended negative consequences
Yeah.
versus a more kind of considered and ecologically aware approach.
Right.
It really makes you think twice about that quick trip to the pet store.
It does. It is. And I think Kesser offers a really compelling alternative
Yeah.
to just relying on those, commercial mixes. Their suggestion is that we should actually focus on creating like a natural habitat in our gardens.
Okay.
So it's almost like designing a landscape
Yeah.
that naturally provides, the resources that birds need.
Okay, so like a self-sustaining bird buffet,
Exact.
planting trees and bushes that offer food,
Yes.
shelter,
Mm-hmm.
and even materials for building their nests.
Exactly. And what's so fascinating is that, even plants that we choose just for their beauty,
Yeah.
can also serve a vital, ecological purpose.
Okay.
So the notes mention like apple and cherry trees.
Yeah.
We enjoy their blossoms, we enjoy the fruit,
The fruit. Yeah.
but they also attract, insects
Yeah.
that the birds will feed on and provide shelter in their branches.
Yeah.
So it's like a win-win.
Yeah. It really highlights how our current gardening habits, which often, are geared towards neatness
Yeah.
and very specific aesthetics,
Yeah.
might not actually be the most bird-friendly.
Right.
And that little messiness
Yes.
could actually be a good thing,
I think so.
for the local wildlife.
Absolutely. And, thinking about your own garden or any green spaces that you have access to, it raises the question, like, are there opportunities to introduce more native plants?
Right.
To allow some areas to be a little less manicured and create a more natural environment that really benefits, the birds directly.
Yeah, definitely food for thought.
Mm-hmm.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, you also mentioned Kesser's observation of a bullfinch outside Oma's kitchen window.
Yes.
This striking bird.
Yeah.
The dompop.
The dompop.
Tell me more about that encounter.
So this was a really specific moment that just brought this whole conversation about garden birds into focus.
Okay.
So Kesser was visiting Oma, and suddenly there's this male bullfinch right outside the window.
Okay.
And Oma shares that she thinks the bullfinch is actually a relatively new arrival to that area.
Oh, wow. So not a common sight historically.
Not necessarily, no.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
It suggests a change in the local bird life.
Yeah, it really does. And it just sort of sparked this natural curiosity.
Yeah.
So the bullfinch, or pyrrhula, is described as a pretty distinctive bird.
Okay.
About 16 centimeters long.
Okay.
So not tiny, but certainly a noticeable presence.
And I love the description.
Yes.
It compares the male's red and black plumage to the robes of a Catholic provost.
It's so vivid.
Yeah, it really gives you a sense of what it looks like.
Yeah.
That vibrant splash of red against the black.
Yeah.
And it's classified as a finch, which led Kesser to ask a very understandable question.
Yeah.
What is a finch?
Yeah, totally. It's like that basic question you might feel a little silly asking.
Yeah, but you're genuinely curious.
Yeah. Well, Oma had a very clear explanation. She said that finches are generally compact birds that mostly live in, wooded areas.
Yeah.
But crucially, their beaks are adapted for eating different kinds of seeds.
So the beak shape gives you a clue as to their diet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Form follows function.
I love that.
Yeah.
And then Steen gets involved.
He does.
Drawn by the smell of Oma's baking.
Yeah.
And he brings this very contemporary element to the whole thing.
He does.
What does he do?
So he immediately reaches for his phone.
Yeah.
And plays the bullfinch's call.
Wow.
And it's just such a great example of how, technology can actually deepen our connection with nature.
Yeah.
Allowing us to experience the sounds.
Yeah.
Learn more about the creatures around us.
Yeah.
In real time.
Okay, so they've seen this striking bird.
Mm-hmm.
They know it's a finch.
Yeah.
With a seed-eating beak.
Yeah.
They've heard its call.
Yeah.
What else did they find out about what it typically eats and where it likes to live?
So the notes actually had a really specific list of the bullfinch's food sources.
Okay.
So it seems they primarily feed on seeds from a variety of trees and plants.
Okay.
Including ash, lilac, maple, birch, stinging nettle, juniper, and rowan.
Okay.
So quite a diverse selection.
Yeah, it really emphasizes that point about diversity of habitat.
It does. And what's really interesting is that in years when seed production is low, or during the winter and spring months, they'll also eat the bugs of deciduous trees and larches.
Okay.
So they've got a backup plan.
Yeah, they're not solely reliant on mature seeds.
Exactly. And they're not actually exclusively plant-based.
Okay.
So in the spring, they'll also eat insects. Which are a crucial source of protein, especially for feeding their young.
Right, so they're playing a role in the garden.
Yeah.
In keeping the insect population under control.
That's exactly.
What about their nesting habits?
Okay.
Where do they typically build their homes?
Well, they often choose spruce trees as nesting sites. And they'll lay between 4 and 6 eggs. Usually in late April or early May. The incubation period is relatively short. Only about 13 days.
Wow.
And the young birds are ready to leave the nest after just 16 to 18 days.
Okay, so they grow up fast.
They do. They do.
I love Steen's reaction to learning about the bullfinch's varied diet.
Oh, yeah.
He's quite enthusiastic.
He is. He's almost in awe as he says that Oma's garden sounds like a self-service buffet for the bullfinch. And it's just such a lovely moment of appreciating, the natural abundance that can exist even in a small garden.
Yeah. And Kesser agrees, pointing out that whether the trees and bushes are naturally occurring or planted by OMA doesn't really matter to the birds.
It doesn't.
They both provide those resources.
Exactly.
And then there's this added thought that maybe natural food sources offer even more, the vitamins and nutrients that the birds need than the processed commercial seed.
Right. Which brings us full circle.
It does.
Back to that conversation about, the quality and appropriateness of supermarket birdseed. That the natural environment with its diversity offers this much broader and more naturally balanced, nutritional profile for these birds.
Now, beyond thinking about, what to feed the birds, Kesser and Steen are also involved in other ways of supporting nature.
Yes.
Things like building nest boxes. And participating in litter cleanups.
Right.
And they do recognize that these are somewhat artificial interventions.
They do.
Not entirely different from selectively feeding birds.
Yeah, they understand that providing nest boxes is creating these, very specific nesting opportunities that might not otherwise exist, and that putting out certain foods can favor some species over others.
Right.
So they're not coming at this with a completely naive view of their impact.
No, but they still see value in those actions.
Absolutely.
What are some of the positives?
Well, the notes highlighted 2 key positive aspects.
Okay.
The first is that they collect and recycle cans and bottles. And they use the money that they get back from that recycling to purchase materials like nails for building their birdhouses.
Oh, that's so resourceful.
Isn't it? It's just so resourceful and sustainable.
Yeah.
A way to support their projects.
I love that.
Yeah, it's taking something that's often seen as waste and turning it into a valuable resource for helping wildlife.
Yeah. And their second reason for doing this is also quite interesting.
It is. So their litter cleanups in natural areas are seen as a form of communication.
Interesting.
So by actively removing the visible signs of human impact, they hope to raise awareness, among others, about the importance of environmental stewardship. So it's a very direct and tangible way of, making a statement.
Such a powerful visual message.
Yeah.
It's not just about cleaning up.
No.
It's about making people think.
Exactly. And then there's the more practical benefit that they've observed as well, which is that, a healthy population of garden birds can actually help to control populations of insects that some people might consider pests. So by supporting bird life, you're also, contributing to a more balanced and healthy garden ecosystem.
Yeah, it all connects.
It does. It does.
From the seeds we choose to the plants in our garden to these more kind of hands-on efforts.
Yeah, and it encourages us to think about the different ways, that we can engage with and support our local ecosystems.
Yeah, and perhaps even you listening to this. To think about what actions you might be able to take in your own community. To make a difference. So to bring it all together.
Okay.
Kesser and Steen's observations, along with that delightful encounter with the bullfinch, really underscore that even something as seemingly simple as the birds in our garden involve a lot of complexity. It's not just about tossing out some seed.
Right.
It's about understanding the needs of these creatures, appreciating the value of natural habitats.
Absolutely.
And recognizing the fascinating lives unfolding right outside our windows.
Right. And I think the key takeaway is that, creating a supportive environment for garden birds can often be achieved through more natural and ecologically sound methods than simply relying on, commercially produced goods. Planting native species and allowing for a bit of natural diversity in our green spaces can be incredibly beneficial.
It really gives you a whole new perspective on what it means to truly support nature.
Absolutely.
And, thinking about Kesser and Steen's creative approach to raising awareness, with their nature cleanups, it makes you wonder what other less conventional ways can individuals use their actions to kind of spark conversations and encourage environmental responsibility in their community?
I think that's a great question.
It makes you think about the impact of these small, thoughtful interventions.
Absolutely.
In the natural world.
Yeah.
Doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
It does.
Have you ever noticed how, like, just hearing birds outside, like, first thing can really get you thinking?
Yeah.